I'm introducing Nikki Bray. She is the former director of Family Life. We've done several programs with them as they've helped us strengthen marriage and strengthen marriages, strengthen our families. Nikki Bray was the former director of Family Life, and now she runs her own ministry that's a coaching ministry. She is a good friend of us here at Shore Community Church, and we're excited to have her come speak to us today. Nikki Bray.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you here this morning. I believe my late husband, Andy, has spoken here a few times, but I've never actually spoken here by myself. I've done a couple of women's events, but it's lovely to be with you on the Sunday morning. Reuben actually asked me a few weeks ago if I would share this morning while he was on sabbatical. So clearly I've said yes, because that's why I'm here this morning. And I just want to give you a bit of context regarding the message that I'm going to be sharing with you. We have been doing a series at Grace City, which is my home church, and that series has been titled Relation Slips. Because let's face it, we all slip up in this whole area of relationships. And so when we were doing that series, Jonathan came to me and asked if I would take on the topic of conflict. And of course I said yes, and so it's this message that I gave at Grace City that I'm going to be sharing with you this morning. And I love speaking on this topic of conflict, surprise, surprise. And that's not because I am good at it, it's purely because it's actually been my greatest challenge in life. And also, I find that it is a topic that most people can relate to. So that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. Now, my late husband, Andy, who we were in ministry with Family Life together, co-directed together, and I always smile now when I say my late husband, Andy, because Andy was always late. He was. I hate using that word always, but truth be told, Andy was always late. And it was one perpetual issue in our marriage that we had conflict over. And I think that Andy, if he was here now, he would find it incredibly funny that I could now legitimately call him my late husband. So there you go. Now, we laugh, but in reality, conflict is no laughing matter. And if you're like me, then you probably don't enjoy being in conflict. You may also think, Reuben Munn does not have conflict. Surely not Reuben. However, I am sure, in fact, I would be certain to say that yes, he does. You can ask his mother. There you go. Alison could tell you. But where we've got relationships with our parents, with children, with friends, with colleagues, there is always the potential for conflict. Where there are people, there is the potential for conflict. And I have taught relationship skills for over 30 years now, and I can tell you that I am still a work in progress over this area. Now I'd like you to turn to the person near to you, so not the person that you came with this morning. So that will either be someone in front of you, behind you, beside you. You may not know them, that's okay. I want you to turn around and say to that person, I have conflict too. Off you go. Okay. All right, we don't want you to get carried away, all right? I don't want to create any conflict, so let's just bring you back to the room. But now that we've just leveled the playing field and we recognize that we all actually experience conflict, let's delve into this topic and understand it a little deeper. And I want to begin by sharing the big idea, which is that conflict is an invitation to grow, not an obstacle to avoid. And if we can start here, if we can change our mindset and understand that it is indeed an opportunity to understand yourself and others better, then we may just lean into potentially tricky conversations more easily and grow through them rather than fear them and run from them. If you're here exploring faith this morning, then you might be encouraged to know that the Bible has a lot to say about life and relationships. When talking about this issue, conflict, James, who was the half-brother of Jesus, he asks the rhetorical question, what causes fights and quarrels among you? He then goes on to say, don't they come from your desires that battle within you? In other words, it's that natural struggle of our sinful nature. We want what we want when we want it. Conflict can also occur when our expectations haven't been met. So someone might have said that they would do something and they haven't followed through, or they've let you down and you're just ticked off. Conflict also arises due to our differences. No two people can share the exact same perspective. We each see life and we experience life differently, and that's normal. And we're often on different pages. And as I said, it is normal to think differently. It is. In fact, my Andy used to say, honey, if we both thought the same about everything, then what's the point in one of us being here? I thought, actually, that's a good point. But we argue, don't we, over our differences. Crazy, I know, but we hate to be wrong and we fight to be right. Or it can be that we've just been hurt. And that could be a current disagreement that you're having with somebody, or maybe something from our past, a childhood trauma. And what do hurting people tend to do? They hurt others. And because our hurt feelings interfere with our ability to think clearly and to act calmly, then we can react in all kinds of unhealthy patterns that were learned in childhood. Now, for me, in my early years, my default pattern was to withdraw, to hide from potential conflict. And that was because growing up, I never saw or experienced difficult issues tackled well. In fact, they were just swept under the carpet. And whenever things did get emotional, people just left. Relationships imploded. And so I developed a subconscious belief that conflict was bad and it needed to be avoided at all costs. Now, out of that avoidance belief grew a fear then of expressing myself, and that fear robbed me of the opportunity to deepen my relationships because I just wouldn't have the tricky conversations. Only when I learned to kick that belief to the curb and replace it with a healthier one did my relationships change. And that healthier one was the one that we're talking about this morning, that conflict is an invitation to grow, not an obstacle to avoid. When I embraced that belief, my marriage grew exponentially, my friendships both personally and at work became much more meaningful, and as my children became older as adults, then our relationships were deeper and much more genuine. Dr. John Gottman is a clinician and a researcher in this field of relationships. And while his research is based on couples, I think his findings relate to both personal and professional relationships. During his 40-year research study, he discovered what he called insights into masters and disasters of relationships. And he found 4 attitudes, and he actually calls them the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And he found these attitudes that when they are present and ongoing, signaled the destruction of a relationship. And I remember thinking at the time, I want to know what those are, because if I do any of those, then I actually need to eliminate them from my interactions. So here they are. The first one is we've got criticism. And this is when we frame a complaint as if there's something defective or wrong with the other person. And it's when we're quick to put another person down, and it might sound like this. You're lazy. You never listen. You're useless with money. Can you hear the tone? It's derogatory, and it's attacking the other person with the you do this or you don't do that, you. and it's making them out to be wrong. And when we feel attacked, this leads to the second horseman, which is defensiveness. So rather than listening to what the other person is saying to us and acknowledging their hurt and then taking responsibility for our part, instead we can get defensive and we can counterattack. We can justify our behavior or even blame the other person. And that can be as simple as saying, well, you do exactly the same thing. And when we're in defensive mode, we are closed off to listening and we're closed off to learning. And then the third attitude is contempt. And that is when all respect has gone and we can take a superior stance, like we know better or we are better. And it can sound like, seriously, you just don't know how to listen. Or communication skills are just so poorly lacking in your department. You know, it's just rude. And you can sense the condemnation in the language and the uncaring tone. And then the fourth one is what he calls stonewalling. And this is when we are physically present with the person, but we're emotionally absent. So we might stay in the room, but we've emotionally vacated. And it's like we're just ignoring the other person. It's kind of like talk to the hand, that kind of stance. And it can show up as the silent treatment. And I'm sure none of you have used that, right? Well, I want to acknowledge that we've all probably used these from time to time. And when they're used occasionally, it's not necessarily a problem, especially if we address it. However, if these attitudes become ongoing or habitual, and that they form the basis of how you regularly interact with someone, the evidence shows us that it can lead then to anger, isolation, or just gridlock, which ultimately will result in a relationship breakdown. Now, in my younger years, I admit that I used defensiveness to keep myself emotionally safe, both in my marriage and in my other relationships. Now, we all have unconscious strategies that we adopt in order to get our core needs met. And these strategies are unknowingly formed in childhood. My earliest memories are as a 5-year-old living in a children's home, feeling alone and emotionally unsafe. And even though I was only there for a year, with hindsight, I can actually see where my defensiveness came from. The need to look out for myself kept me hypervigilant and it kept me wary of people. And so over time, that guardedness became a natural way for me to do life in general. I also learned in the children's home that to be accepted and belong, I actually needed to suppress my needs and please our caregivers and kind of blend in. Not healthy, by the way. Now, others can behave very differently in their defensiveness. They've learned to be aggressive and to fight for their needs to be met or their voice to be heard. And all of these learned childhood behaviors made sense at the time because they worked. They got our core needs met. However, the problem is as we grow older, we continue to live out of those learned behaviors without realizing that what once served us is now no longer useful. The Apostle Paul, who was one of the early leaders of the church, he made this great statement. He said, "When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put away childish things." The problem is that most of us don't put those childish ways of thinking and behaving behind us. And so understanding ourselves and choosing to put away these unhealthy, self-protective attitudes are essential for us to embrace conflict as an opportunity. It's an invitation to unlearn unhelpful patterns, to heal, and instead develop healthy ones and grow more like Jesus in the process. When we choose to understand our patterns and those of other people, then we're able to quit being self-protective, and we can then press into tricky conversations with healthy, respectful self-expression instead. So what does that look like practically? Well, respectful self-expression involves lovingly putting the issue on the table, so to speak, by doing as the Apostle Paul says, speaking the truth in love. Speaking the truth in love. Now, this means speaking honestly and directly, but with a tone of kindness. There is no place for brutal honesty and harshness when dealing with people. Hearts can easily be broken. They can easily be hurt. And while we cannot be responsible for how someone receives our words, we are responsible and accountable for how we communicate. And by the way, Paul goes on to say, and I paraphrase, that when we speak the truth in love, we are becoming mature in Jesus. So how can we do that? Well, before we bring something up with someone, we first need to determine if the offense requires confrontation. So rather than instinctively react in the moment, which a lot of us can do, it helps instead to pause, take a step back, and spend some time examining what happened. The book of Proverbs in the Bible has nuggets of wisdom, and one of them being that sensible people control their temper. They earn respect by overlooking wrongs. In other words, not everything needs confronting. Don't sweat the small stuff, so to speak. And generally, we would do well to have an attitude that chooses to think the best of people. People will do things that irritate us, and vice versa. My Andy was on a kidney dialysis machine for 27 years in total, but 17 years of our married life, he was actually on a kidney machine. And when you're on dialysis, you can't drink fluid whenever you want to because the kidneys can't get rid of the fluid. And so you're only allowed 900 mils of fluid a day. So that meant that Andy lived with a constant thirst that used to drive him crazy. And one of the ways that he alleviated, or he tried to alleviate his thirst, was to eat apples. You know, apples are so juicy, and so he would eat so many apples to alleviate this thirst. And you should have seen him eating those apples. It was absolutely hideous, and it was disgusting to watch him eat those apples because he was sucking the life out of those things. And I would watch him and think, this is just horrific. This is just awful. And I tried talking to him about it because it just used to frustrate me. And I would say to him, go in another room or try and eat it quietly. But, you know, he never changed in this area because he wasn't interested. He was only interested in alleviating his thirst, and I get it. But some of us would do well to remember the acronym Q-TIP, meaning quit taking it personally, especially if it is really just small stuff. But of course, that poses a question, right? How do we determine if it's just small stuff? And I decided that if it had the potential to become a major issue, if it could get in the way of an important relationship thriving, or if it was still causing me angst 24 hours later, then it needed addressing, preferably within the next 48 hours. Now, with Andy's apple eating, it only drove me mad in the moment. It wasn't a major issue. I'd forgotten about it once that had moved on. So if we've spent time then examining the issue and we've determined that it does need addressing, then the next step is to consider our own part in the conflict. So asking ourselves questions such as, what role did I play? Or how am I contributing to this issue? These are wise questions to reflect on and give insight into our own habits that need addressing. The next step is also an internal one. Are you willing to seek the other person's perspective as well as our own? Jesus' disciple Matthew stated, Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, "Let me take the speck out of your eye," when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? Sometimes we're too quick to point the finger at the speck that our brother has and then instantly blame or judge the other person. Asking ourselves if we are truly willing to hear their side, their hurts and their disappointments, and not just focus on our own, are helpful. And if we can honestly, in all humility, answer yes, then we can know that we're ready to have the conversation. Timing is also crucial. So rather than just considering our needs and what suits us, we need to consider what's beneficial for the other person. And simply asking permission shows respect. Is this a good time to have a chat about something? Sometimes I've been told, not right now, can we do it tomorrow? But most of the time it's been, sure, what's up? However, if someone says that it's not a good time, then that is okay. We need to honor that, but ensure that you do set a future time in case they're using it as an avoidance strategy. Or if you don't want to talk about it straight away, again, that's okay, but we need to offer a time when we will. And then above all, we need to take care with the words that we use when we express ourselves. Remember this, you can't be too kind with people. When the time comes to finally speak, saying the truth in love requires us to be direct and honest. And some of us need to be told that being direct and clear is actually being kind. So let's just kind of make this personal. Let's just say that you've had a tricky situation at work with a colleague, and you're left kind of feeling uneasy about it, and you want to bring it up, but you don't kind of know how. It can look like this. I'd like to talk to you about something that was said in our meeting last week. Is this a good time to have a quick chat? I don't know if you were aware, but you said in front of our colleagues that I can procrastinate. And I found that comment hurtful, and I felt embarrassed and misunderstood. And as a result, I don't know if you've noticed, but I've actually been avoiding you. And I'm asking in future, if there's an issue, would you please talk to me privately rather than openly in a team meeting? I would really appreciate that. Now, notice how the example contains 5 elements. So firstly, gaining permission. Asking the other person if it's a good time to talk. Secondly, telling the person what specifically they have done. You said in front of our colleagues that I can procrastinate. Thirdly, taking responsibility for your own emotions and feelings and then sharing them with the other person. I felt embarrassed and misunderstood. Telling the person what the consequences have been. I've been avoiding you. And then fifthly, telling the other person what you want them to do. Talk to me privately rather than openly in a team meeting. Now, years ago, I remember when my son Ben, he's now 30, but I remember when Ben was a young teenager and he had acquired his driver's license. And he had borrowed my car and he didn't fill it up with petrol afterwards. Kind of typical teenage behavior. And I went to go to work the following morning and I found the tank empty and I was brassed off with him. I really was. And so I spent some time thinking about it, how I wanted to speak to him, because as a teenager, Ben could get very antagonistic and I wanted the conversation to go well. So after some processing, this is kind of what I said to him. Ben, before you go out tonight, can we have a quick chat, please? So I gained permission. When I went to work this morning, the car had no petrol and I had to stop urgently to fill it up. So I explained what happened. I almost missed my meeting, which was very frustrating. I shared how I felt, and that put me under a lot of unnecessary pressure. I presented the consequences. Now, there might be a good reason why you didn't fill it up, and if that's so, please feel free to tell me. However, in future, when you borrow the car, I need you to be responsible for putting petrol in it if the tank is low. Otherwise, it's not going to be available to you. So I explained what I wanted. And I prepared myself for a heated response because normally that's what I would get, but none came. Surprise, surprise. Instead, he just looked at me and he went, "Oh, my bad. Sorry, sure, I can do that." I was flabbergasted, seriously. I was so shocked. Now, it won't always be received so well. Just the other day, I used this process with a friend, and initially, she got miffed with me. But I thought, that's okay. She is entitled to her response. My responsibility is to be respectful and kind with my words and to manage my own emotions. And I've done that to the best of my ability. Now, these kind of interactions take time. However, for people to feel valued and respected, we need to consider how we are speaking and take the time necessary to say something well. We can think that we have communicated what we want, but we often aren't as clear and direct as we think we are. And one of the most helpful skills is adopting I language rather than you language. When we communicate with a you statement, it can feel very confrontational to the other person, very accusatory, and people can feel like they're being attacked. And often the reason that things flare up is because we put up with issues or conflict for way too long before we actually say anything. We don't nip it in the bud, but instead we will leave things to fester away, and so when we bring it up, there's often a lot of unnecessary emotion that's involved. So it's way healthier to address things sooner when they are small rather than let them escalate and build up. And we do this by taking ownership of our thoughts and feelings, starting with an I statement. So let's go back to the work situation. And let's say that your colleague is running late submitting a proposal, and you're ticked off with them. So rather than saying, "You're procrastinating," I just want you to take a moment and in your head, just think about how you would say that using an I statement. So rather than "you're procrastinating," it could be, "I'm feeling annoyed that this project is now late," or "I'm incredibly frustrated that this is putting a lot of pressure on our team." What about if you're in a dating relationship? Rather than "you never call or text me," what about saying with an I statement, "I feel like I'm doing all the initiating in this relationship," or "I'm feeling that I'm not a priority at the moment," which, if we're honest, is probably how we're feeling. What about, and I hear this a lot in marriages, "you're not listening," with an I statement saying, "I'm feeling unheard," or "you're bossy." That's never going to go well. "I'm feeling controlled." Or if you're in a flatting situation, rather than saying, "you don't do anything around this flat," saying, "I feel like I'm doing more than my fair share, and can we have a conversation about how we can balance this out?" So you statements can tend to create more conflict or shut conversations down, whereas I statements tend to open up conversations. I statements can still sting if someone uses it with you, but we need to have the maturity to pay attention to what the other person is trying to communicate. And if you're a couple in a relationship and you both commit to using I statements, when you start using them, it's going to feel awkward. But persist, because even if you and your partner don't quite say it right, remind yourself that at least you're each trying. Choose grace. It takes time to build new skills. And then after a conversation, it can be helpful to clarify and ask the other person what they've actually heard. rather than assume that we have communicated clearly, because things can get lost in translation. Expressing ourselves well takes time, it takes attention, it takes humility, and it takes a teachable heart. And as I say, initially it can feel clumsy because it's probably unfamiliar to us. But the more that we practice something, then the more familiar it becomes, until in time it does become second nature. Remember that experiencing conflict is not a bad thing. It's an invitation. And if it's handled well, it provides a massive growth opportunity. And I can promise you that behind every good, flourishing relationship, there's a lot of hard conversations that's been had. You must be willing to say what you believe, to express what you need, and to confront what's not working. Don't avoid the hard conversations, because what is left unsaid can often then become assumptions which are unhelpful and most of the time are not true. And sometimes I think we're reluctant because we can also misunderstand Scripture. The Bible clearly tells us to pursue peace, to make peace the prize, and to be at peace with everyone. And of course, that is true, but we can misunderstand and we can think that we are called to be peacekeepers, which is not true. We're told to be peacemakers, and it's helpful to know the difference. So, what is a peacekeeper? Well, peacekeepers, they can walk on eggshells so that they don't want to upset anyone. They can be people pleasers. They don't share their true feelings, and they can be passive aggressive. They avoid tricky conversations. They're often victims, and they're often resentful. This is not peace. Peacemakers, on the other hand, are intentional, and they're committed to truth-telling in love. In other words, they see conflict as an invitation to grow, not an obstacle to avoid. They directly communicate their feelings with kindness. They also take responsibility for their actions, and they initiate resolution. They're often humble and they're teachable. This is courageous action, and this is what we are called to. And Jesus himself said, and I love this, he said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." He's reminding us that those who accept the invitation and work through conflict in order to bring about restoration are favored by God. Conflict with others is inevitable, but when we stop seeing it as an obstacle to avoid, and then we start seeing it as an invitation to grow, everything changes. Picture this. You walk into work. There's no tension in the air. There's no hushed conversations by the coffee machine. Why? Because you and your colleagues have learned to address issues directly and kindly. You've discovered the relief that comes when you can share concerns without fear of being attacked. Imagine marriages where couples don't tiptoe around each other or let that resentment build, but instead they lean into tricky conversations with curiosity and a real desire to understand. These couples don't have fewer disagreements, they have healthier ones that actually bring them closer together. Think about your kids growing up seeing conflict handled with grace. They learn that you can love someone deeply and still work through your differences. They then enter relationships equipped because they've seen what healthy conflict looks like. Here's the thing. When we stop running from difficult conversations and we start running towards the growth that they offer, something beautiful happens. We discover that on the other side of that tricky conversation, that scary conversation, is often a deeper connection and the joy of relationships that can handle reality. This is what Jesus meant when he called us peacemakers. Not people who avoid conflict, but people who courageously work through it in order to create genuine peace. So here's your challenge. Look for one relationship where you have been peacekeeping instead of peacemaking. Find that conversation that you have been avoiding, and remember, you can't be too kind with people, but kindness includes the courage to speak the truth in love. The invitation is right there in front of you. Conflict is an invitation to grow, not an obstacle to avoid. It is waiting to teach you something about yourself, about others, and about God's grace. This week, can I encourage you to talk to God about this and ask for his help as you learn, or as we all learn, to apply what we have talked about this morning. Let me close in prayer. Lord Jesus, would you strengthen and equip us to handle conflict well? May we be self-aware of how we can cause hurt to other people and whom we may have unintentionally hurt. Jesus, may we have teachable hearts that want to grow, and may we have the courage and the willingness to initiate and pursue peace. In our world where conflict is just out of control today, may we be peacemakers in the way that we handle our everyday relationships. And as followers of Jesus, may this be our witness, and may we represent you well. Lead us with the power of your Holy Spirit.